Unknowing, or agnosia, is not ignorance or nations as ordinarily understood, but rather the realization that no finite knowledge can fully know the infinite, and that therefore it is only truly to be approached by agnosia, or by that which is beyond and above knowledge. Today, our guest is David Chaim Smith, author, contemplative mystic, and radical renunciate. I'm your host, Augustine Reyes, and this is Agnosia Podcast. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the podcast. Today, I'm welcomed with David Chaim Smith, author of 9 books on contemplative mysticism, basically all founded in the root text, the Fountain of Wisdom. Is that correct, Dave?
Yeah. That's the basis of the symbol system that runs concurrently throughout all the books.
Excellent. Can you share with the listeners as far as what the view is specifically as presented, say, in the 32 Keys, probably your most practical work to date?
Yeah.
And how that all fits together?
Well, generally, I use the term nonemanationist to describe the view, nonemanationism, which is a departure from the ordinary one that you find in Kabbalistic systems and alchemical systems, where you have a series of levels that function as a hierarchy with the absolute vision of divine purity at the top and the fragmented world of solidity and substance and physical matter at the bottom, right? There's usually a ladder system, degrees of subtlety, connecting these 2 points. And that's generally how emanationist systems are presented, meaning that the absolute emanated in levels to degrees with various stages in this kind of filing cabinet order of a structure. I am not denying that such a structure presents itself in exactly the manner as it's described by most of these systems, which differ from one to another, but they're all basically founded in the same kind of causal manifesting structure. And I am not disputing that. However, what is radical about what I do and what breaks from that is the fact that there is a singular ground that upholds the phenomena that is presented this way. And that no matter how many degrees of levels and stages and how subtle or gross the stages might get, there is a common denominator which does not change, that runs throughout all of it. And that is actually the most important part. That is where you glimpse the moment of pure mystery inherent in any phenomena on any possible level, in any possible world, with any attribute. And you could always find your way through the secret mystery of that glimpse back to the fundamental ground of the essential nature of phenomena. That is where the alchemical process really begins. And it can be found anywhere, in anything. As the alchemical texts say in the 17th century, it is the most common thing on earth.
Can I ask you a question about that?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, from some of the alchemical texts that I've read, including, well, and I say read, quote unquote, but like takes, for instance, Splendor Solus, it seems as though we start with one substance, we transmute it and get another substance. And when I read, say, something like Deep Principles of Kabbalistic Alchemy, or when you go through the 32 Keys, you said yourself, it's not a transubstantiation, it's the change of meaning for the, and again, I'm trying to use conventional language here, which we know falls apart, but for the subject and the object. Am I stating that right? Does that even sound right?
Yeah, it does, because like you started out by saying, we start with a substance and then it becomes something else. Well, what is a substance? What is the thing that you're initially starting out with? We're assuming that our take on the original substance that we're starting with is the correct one.
Right.
So if we
Yeah.
think that there is a thing called physical matter, and then we start to work with it and produce whatever subtlety we arrive at as a result of our practice, whatever we come up with will be predicated on the fact that we thought that something existed to begin with. And that is a way to express meaning in a certain register. You believe the superficial face of reality. You believe that reality is what it purports to be in the manner in which it presents itself. What I'm saying is totally different. What I'm saying is there actually is no such thing as substance. That what we call substance is a presentation of phenomena in a certain register of meaning. We assume that what it means is solidity, difference, separation, concreteness, right? All of these qualities that we would ascribe to physical matter, we assume are meanings that are correct. Well, when we transmute this so-called substance, this phenomena, what we're really doing is shifting the meaning from a set of assumptions that we thought were true to a finer, deeper investigation and inquiry into the nature of a mystery that we cannot comprehend. And what is derived is just an ever increasingly subtle series of meanings, rather than think that there's an actual substance that becomes something else, and then something else, and then something else, something else. If we do away with the concept that there is a thing to begin with, then all we have is meaning.
Right.
It's all meaning. It was always meaning the whole time. So in a sense, what I'm saying is really keeping the original spirit of the alchemical process, but really doing it in a wildly different way in terms of the language and the form of the symbology of how we talk about it.
Right. Right. Okay. Um, you know, as far as that goes, you know, when we, do you have any ideations or theories on why language breaks down, as far as trying to describe this? You know, because it'd be great if we lived in a world where, you know, I could communicate to a student, or a teacher could communicate to me, this is how this happens. But instead,
Yeah, well,
yeah, go on. Sorry.
sure. Well, it doesn't work. It breaks down because it doesn't work. A language is predicated on dualistic assumptions. And if you are striving to realize the non-dual, then dualistic linguistic structures, dualistic structures in language are going to crap out at a certain point, because the entire structure of language is based on the verb to be, what something is, and predicated on states of being in action is always the implication of a subject, a knower of something, and an object, something that is known. That's always there in language. Language is only structured to support the actions of a subject in relation to an object. It is a dualistic construct. So it can't go past a certain point when you're talking about a style of inquiry that is specifically and totally cited on doing the opposite of what that linguistic structure is designed to do. That's why at a certain point, ordinary conventional language has to be left by the wayside, and we have something else to put in its place, which are symbols. And the symbols can communicate by implication to do things that ordinary words and sentences can't do.
So if I restated what you said, and I'm going to try and do this to the best of my ability, language at the outset, just it starts us in the conceptual. Is that fair?
Yeah, language is just a series of conceptual designations on identities.
Okay.
And identities break down into two types: identities of a perceiving subject and a perceived object or object state. It's always one or the other.
Okay.
Pretty much any qualifier, adjective or adverb type qualifier that you use is in relation to a subject or an object in their interaction. So All of these fall under the category of conceptual designations. We designate that something has a certain value and has a certain meaning, and then that thing functions as an equivalent for that meaning. For example, there's the great Rene Magritte painting from the 30s, which is a painting of a pipe. And in French or Belgian or whatever it is, at the bottom, it says, "This is not a pipe."
Right.
No,
Yeah.
of course it's not a pipe, idiot. It's a painting of a pipe. Right. So
Yeah.
what it's meant to do is call our attention to the fact that when we designate something with a label, it's not what we think it is. It is a designated label for something that is not present in the designation. Right?
Right.
Like, how would we ever know that this is a glass that I'm holding up unless we had a direct experience of the glass? Well, if we have a direct experience of the glass, then we look at the word glass or anything I could possibly say about it. And there's a huge gulf of difference between anything I could say about this glass and knowing the actual reality of what it represents. Meaning, if you take the glass away and I tell you all about it, you'll never know the experience of the thing. You'll only know a series of designated equivalents.
Right.
But once you get to see it and hold it, then everything snaps together, right? So there's this difference between, in Kabbalah, what they call direct and reflected manifestation, direct and reflected existence. When something is reflected, we get it secondhand, you always lose something.
Okay. Is this what's meant by the view with regards to the mirror? Let me try and get a little bit more specific, because that can go all over the place. You have a way of using the metaphor of being in a car and looking in a rearview mirror, and everybody in the car can see different angles from the same mirror. Is that the same thing when we talk about reflective versus directive?
100%, because the image in the mirror actually doesn't tell you anything about the mirror itself, because the mirror itself doesn't have an image.
Right. Okay.
The mirror itself is a total mystery. If you can only think that you know the mirror based on the constantly changing reflections that you see in the mirror, you see an ever-changing parade of different angles from your own point of view, but you still don't know anything about the mirror. So the mirror becomes a metaphor for the mind and for knowing in general, that there's a difference between the functions of knowing, which are like the reflections in the mirror, which are relative, which are changeable, which are from this or that point of view, and the knowingness itself, which is open and can know anything and is changeless, doesn't change, and is not limited to any point of view ever, is in itself, from the perspective of the points of view, unknowable. So the pure, open potency of knowing, if you were only to look at what is known, you would never have any inkling how to approach such a mystery. So the difference in the view is the shift between the relative, ever-changing display of phenomena being like this or like that, and the pure, pristine potency itself, the pure potentiality that we refer to as Ein Sof. All I'm saying is that no matter what phenomena presents itself, it's Ein Sof. It has never departed from Ein Sof. Nothing can ever enter or leave. It is the essential nature of reality. So as far as I'm concerned, all roads go there. That's all we're really interested in. When we're talking about spiritual development, alchemical process, the structure of Kabbalah, it is all just a methodology to realize the essential nature of the divine, the essential nature of Ein Sof. That is our sole concern, our only fundamental preoccupation. The rest of it is a footnote.
Gotcha. that kind of ties into what I was going to ask you about the first commandment. Um, in Messenger, you and I spoke about, you know, one, opting out of society, you know, opting out of culture. Um, would you say that uh, just following the first commandment of the Old Testament is sufficient? Um, and let me preface that even further by asking, um, how do you equate the infinite or Ein Sof with the God of the Old Testament, like you did when we were talking?
Well, this is a really, really good question because it brings up so many different facets of secondary repercussions. You know, like, first of all, let's state what we're talking about here. The first commandment is, you shall have no other God before me. You'll have no other God but me. Essentially, on the exoteric level, God presents itself as a giant ego.
Right.
You know,
Right.
basically an authoritarian dictatorial tyrant who rules through threats and intimidation. That's the God of the Old Testament in mythological terms. In esoteric terms, what's being stated here through a series of symbols is something really quite different. Because remember, the only fundamental interest of exoteric religion is to shove a bunch of laws at you and get you to conform within a system of codes of behavior, right? So if you're not interested in that, what could the one God be that you shall have no other of? Well, if it's Ein Sof, if it's a concept of divine, it has nothing to do with ordinary theology, then we're free to look at that statement and say, nothing but this. Well, that's just an assertion of single-pointed focus. And for a contemplative mystic, it's a very good idea to have no other interests, to not think anything else is really fundamentally important but divine inquiry. So that anything else that arises, anything else that you do is a subset of that. If you have no other God before me, then you're solely and completely and totally dedicated to divine inquiry, for whatever that means. How I perceive the meaning of that statement is really going to be quite the opposite of what an exoteric religionist would hold. Then comes the issue of theism.
Right. Yeah. Um, how do we unpack that?
What's that?
I said, how do we unpack that? You know, as far as you know, we can obviously take that into exoteric versus esoteric views. I mean, I think you talked about that already when we talk about emanationism itself. You know, um, but what then? I mean, if you're not a positive theist, a panentheist, how does a mystic deal with the notion of a theistic God, or do they?
That's a really good question. You see, I always like to sort of playfully suggest that my view is exactly like pantheism, except for the theism. So I like the pan part because we're definitely talking about an absolute infinite continuum that doesn't have an interruption or an interval within it. But my view in relation to the essence of reality is that its fundamental characteristic is its openness. And that openness is self-luminous. It radiates its own power and potency because it is not merely open in the sense of like a void or an absence. It's so full of pure possibility that you can't reduce it to any set of possibilities or relationship between possibilities. So it's an open fullness. Very often the word that is used for this is plenum. It's a plenum of possibility. So if that is taken in a radical register, you can't reduce it to anything whatsoever. You can't reduce it to a supreme being about which you would ascribe qualities and attributes and certainly dictatorial edicts. You can't say that you could take literally any of the mythological stories or setups for essentially legal issues that are used tribally in the Old Testament. So the issue of theism is really a question of this. How much are we going to reify the ground of phenomena? How much are we going to reduce the sum total of the continuum of all things to just one giant thing? In other words, are we going to treat it dualistically as God talking to us? Or are we going to treat it monistically, which is the reification of the whole? Well, my view is to dismiss both the dualism, the monism, any reification of that open fullness whatsoever is out the window. Radical non-reification. So if we take the view of radical non-reification, and all things, no matter how they present themselves, are just simply some expression of that open fullness. And if that's truly our God, and we have nothing before us but that, you will have no other God before you, right?
Right.
Then that's the only thing we're interested in. So from that standpoint, how could you even call it theism anymore? And this is where I break through theological assumptions. And this is why I say it's just the same as pantheism, except for the theism. Because if you're taking out all reification, you don't have a theistic basis or referent anymore for the inquiry, because it's open. It's radically open. So this falls under the category that ordinarily is described theologically as apophatic mysticism. But I actually take it way further than the ordinary context in which apophatic mysticism is discussed, for example, in the Orthodox Church, in Orthodox theology. And I view it more like radical systems of non-duality in other contexts would be taken. For example, there are certain Vajrayana and Advaitic ways of approaching the ground as an absolute nothingness that are closer to what I'm purporting here.
So there are, there's a number of questions that arise out of that. One of the ones at the top of my mind, though, is I'm going to try and restate what you just said, and if let me know where you find fault in it, because I'd like to clear something up in my own mind, and something I think when I've spoken to other people who've read your work, if I understood what you just said correctly, then literally everything is divine, and what contemplation does is it allows us to recognize that. It allows us to see the separateness that culture maybe has created, or just overall body mind habit has created, like say from our parents or whatever the case might be. Is that a good way to restate that? Or
yeah, the only problem is that we could make sort of philosophical statements like everything is divine essentiality, right? Everything is essentially nothingness, fullness that expresses itself. And we would be correct in that statement. However, for almost every single person who could make that statement, you could make the true statement, but not fully realize or actualize the truth of it. It becomes just another concept or philosophy for you. So although that statement is absolutely true, it does us no good whatsoever unless we could actually realize it through our own practice. And that's the rub, that's the problem, because I am not suggesting it just to make an accurate philosophical assessment of phenomena. That helps, it's a good starting point, but ultimately we have to we have to get to work inquiring about why this is true, proving to ourselves that it's true through the direct interface with phenomena, its texture, its fullness, its pervasiveness, its qualities of open, radiant fullness. We should start to investigate whether these are actually speaking through phenomena or whether it's just some stupid idea.
Right.
Because even if it's an idea that's correct, just an idea is not going to help us. It's not going to change our lives. It's not going to open up every cell of our physical body and every bit of the thrust of the dynamism of our mind towards that one goal. You shall have no other God before me. If that's really Ein Sof, and it's going to displace the exoteric idea of a system of laws, and we have no interest in that, as I think you and I don't.
Mhm.
If it's
Right.
going to mean this greater thing,
Yeah.
it's got to be pervasive with the whole of our being. It's got to involve the whole of our life, all our life force, the entire trajectory of our existence. And that's not a philosophy anymore. The philosophies may be a starting point, maybe, but ultimately it becomes practice. And the extent to which our practice bears fruit becomes our level of realization. And I have many ways of describing that and talking about that within the system, how one approaches levels of realization in a way that can be examined and scrutinized and improved. So ultimately, it sounds like a good philosophy, but it all comes to the test in every moment when the mind is expressed. And either it's real or it's really of no value. And the whole point of one's practice as a contemplative mystic is to prove the reality of such a view in every moment,
Gotcha.
in a radical sense.
Yeah.
Because who cares what I say?
I mean, I think a lot of people care, but I get your meaning at the same time. That brings up another question. I'd like, there aren't enough hours in the day to run down all of these paths that.
Oh, we got all day.
Fair enough. So with that said, let me start with the first thing that comes to mind, which is something, again, you and I talked about before the show. If everything is from a divine register, I hear the argument from, we'll say, Western esotericists who are fond of using psychedelics from, anything as small as, say, marijuana to as, and I'll show my age here, like as far as DMT, because I'm sure there's probably more things and, more developed chemicals these days that can get you there however quickly. So if that's all an expression of the divine, I already have in my own mind a reason why it's still something that I don't want to incorporate into my practice. But how do you make that separation in your own mind, Dave?
Well, when I was growing up, I did a lot of psychedelics, of course, like anybody my age with my interests probably would. And the conclusion that I came to was that psychedelics were all about experience and refining experience, levels of subtle experience, probing into new horizons of experience, blah, blah, blah. Practice is not about experience. Practice is about the wisdom of the ground. And since experience is always changing and the divine ground is changeless and doesn't change, it's a question of emphasis. Are we interested in an amusement park of entertainment or study or inquiry or qualities and attributes and chasing after them and discovering new ones and immersing yourself in the fullness of that jungle of psychoetheric exploration? Or are we interested in what I started out talking about earlier, the realization of that which transcends experience and its qualities and its attributes and its points of view and its types. I don't see psychedelics having any value whatsoever in contemplative mysticism, because it is obsessed with its own body, the body of experience. It seems to be the end of it. Now, I could make a pretty good case for saying that certain people who grow up in an uptight context, in an uptight culture, need to be pushed a little bit, nudged over the edge to break loose of the static notion of the mind's habits. And that maybe at a certain point, relatively early on in one's exploration, it's good to know that these other registers are possible. So psychedelics are very effective at letting a young person know that things are possible beyond their wildest dreams. And that's good. That's a nice start. But that doesn't sound like mysticism to me. That sounds like a psychological preparation for maybe the possibility of something else. I don't see the ground shining through the psychedelic experience. I just see more experience shining through the psychedelic experience. It seems to me to be a trap.
Right, right.
And the trap, once it labels its endless acquisition of experiences a path, I think a very big mistake is being made. Because then such a person who makes a mistake like that will never know what the real path is. They'll think it's about just acquiring more experiences. And
Right.
they call those experiences sublime or divine, or they can put any appellation they want on those experiences. They're still going to be experiences, which means that they function dualistically, which means that they function a subject against an object in some register, even if it's a very, very subtle monistic register. It becomes a trap. And I did a lot of LSD and DMT in my youth, obviously.
Well, and let me ask you this, just to help hammer that nail into that coffin. All that experience does, because again, this is something, just trying to understand for myself here. All that change of experience does is it allows the ruach or the ego to move in a different pattern than what they otherwise would, but it's still just movement. It's still just wind, right?
Well, I'm very glad you're using the Kabbalistic language, because yeah, there's a culmination point at the apex of the Ruach, which is the quasi-sphera of Dot. And Dot summarizes what the Ruach is and what the Ruach does. So what psychedelics do is they just factor into that Dot summary of the knowledge of the winds, as you say, of the Ruach in their constant turbulence and turning and storming, which becomes a series of atmospheres that give the texture of experience its aroma and it's the pervasiveness of its meaning, which seeps through its own pores. If you look at the sum total of the atmospheres of reality as you know it as one giant body, what seeps through the cells of that body in space, in time, in energy, they have certain textures and qualities and characteristics, which we call rasas, feeling tones, right? And what psychedelics are very good at is shifting and deepening the level of subtlety of those feeling tones, of those resonances, of those energetic modes of expression, which are quite etheric and practically intangible. The sum total of the way that these feelings create a wholeness is the Dot of the Ruach, is the summary of your knowledge of the etherics of your mind's activity. That's all well and good. But what mysticism is concerned with is far beyond that. That is actually just a stepping stone. Ultimately, what mysticism does is it takes that sum total of all the experiences and points of view and environments and atmospheres and uses it as a sacrifice, consumes it on the altar of one's practice, and ultimately reduces it to nothing, consumes itself through itself, right? Literally burns itself alive and offers its own smoke, the way the Israelites offered a calf on the fire of the holy temple, right? It is literally a burning, whole burned offering that you make out of the sum total of the contents of your psyche. That's the only offering you have. Ultimately, it is the sum total of everything to you. You got to give it all away. You got to put it all on the fire. So it seems to me that if you make the flesh of that offering the stopping point, you're missing the sacrifice entirely. And what's the point of that? You just become a fatted calf at that point.
Right. That brings up another question for me here. Having had your history of practice in, and correct me where I'm wrong, but in both Thelema and Golden Dawn tradition style Western esotericism, would it be fair to say, and again, here goes that trigger warning that we were talking about in Facebook Messenger. So if you're offended by this, just think about why you're offended by it. And I don't mean you, Dave, I mean whoever is listening at home. Do you think that the modern ceremonial magician is also chasing states in the same way that, say, somebody who's using psychedelics is? Is there a point at which that can be escalated or elevated? And I bring that up because you and I talked about, I had the, I'll say, desire to start working with the Shem angels to, bring about this state of contemplation. And you helped me out of that rather quickly. And if you want to go into detail about that, that's fine. Otherwise, like if you just want to answer that question, or if
I honestly, I think that the technology is neutral. And I don't think that the technology of ceremonial magic, let's say, for example, Solomonic magic, I don't see it as either good or bad, positive or negative. It all depends on the purpose for which it is employed. If the end game is realization of the divine, one can call upon a great variety of spiritual intelligences to help with the moment by moment progression through whatever states present themselves. And in that case, if one were working with that end game of realization in mind, the use of ceremonial magic would be a very wonderful and sophisticated tool to have at one's disposal, no question about it. However, if it becomes a trap and one is really only interested in communing with spirit intelligences for the experience or the power or the expanded range of dialogue. In other words, if one becomes entranced with the glamour of communicating with the spirits and is set within the dimensions in which they live as a ceiling without the great work being the reason why they're doing it, well, then the system shuts down and it becomes just another ordinary activity, really no different than anything else. You're sealed with an experience. It becomes just like doing psychedelics. Some of the people who do psychedelics really have spiritual interests, and they'll discover through their use of the psychedelics the unnecessary burden of the melting walls and the pixelating light clusters and sheets of meaning falling all over them, and ultimately they might become practitioners, in which case if the psychedelics led them to that, then it served a function. But if they become trapped, then they're trapped. They're slaves in Egypt at that point. Same thing with ceremonial magic. Why are you doing what you're doing? What's the end game? So I definitely don't condemn any methodology. Even the basest level of sorcery can be used for the great work. It all depends what the intention is. The intentionality is the main question that you're asking about here. the search for meaning, as Frankl would say, right? To give meaning to life. What is the purpose? Well, it's a big purpose. What's the ultimate reason why you're doing what you're doing? It can't be just merely curiosity, which it is for some ceremonial magicians. Now, the other thing that I find distressing is I don't believe the grimoires, many of them. I think that spirits that have names and qualities which are purported to be at the disposal of a magician based on a certain formulaic way of approaching them, how do you know? How do you know that they are what they say that they are what they purport to be? And how do you know that maybe there aren't other agendas behind the availability of such spirits? And maybe they're beneficial, maybe they're malevolent. How would you know? If you're getting it from a book. Now, well, I'll tell you one thing. If you're getting it from a book, you're setting yourself up for a serious problem. And the only way where I could see it possibly working out is from some kind of oral tradition, maybe involving books, maybe not involving books, where somebody who has mastered the territory is showing you. But if you're alone in your house with a book, going blindly into a dark alley, not knowing exactly why you're doing what you're doing, you could get into a lot of trouble. Or you could be facing a whole lot of nothing. I hope that doesn't trigger people, but hey, that's what I believe.
Yeah. So let me change gears here for just a second. You mentioned going down dark alleys, and when you said that, it reminded me again, what we were talking about in Messenger. I'm hoping that you'll share the story about having been kidnapped.
Yeah, sure. When I was a dumb kid, I was always interested in Kabbalah, right? So even when I was, a kid doing drugs in New York in the 70s, I was poking around the Magical Child bookstore and places like that, and, finding this or that book. And always knew that Hermetic Kabbalah, the way that, Thelema and the Golden Dawn presented it, was this oversimplified version. Was interested in like some deeper sources, and the selection of translations were very few in the years before Aria Kaplan, you could say. So when I saw Orthodox Jews who were interested in such things, I very often made a point of bothering them, like, to try to ask them for books, or could you guys talk to me? And, they never would. But I came upon one time this group of Hasids who had a synagogue in a house. I was living in Providence, Rhode Island at the time, and doing a lot of drugs. And I remember hearing like this weird noise from the backyard one day. I was up getting high in my room. I mean, this is like, I was in my 20s. I was in my early to mid 20s. So I went down there and I saw, a bunch of Hasids are living in a house behind me. And I just filed that. And I thought about it for a while, and I thought, yeah, I got nothing to do. I wonder if they got any Kabbalah books, or whether they're willing to talk to me. I'm not doing anything today. So I went down there and saw them, and they looked weird. They didn't look normal. They looked a little menacing. They were a bit renegade. I don't know who they were,
right?
But they were off. So I introduced myself. They didn't say anything, right? Okay, fine. Fast forward some period of time. I don't even know how long it was. It was a Friday afternoon, and I get this banging on my door, violent banging on my door. And this big, fat, gnarly looking Hasid was banging the crap out of my door. Yeah. So I go down there. I'm like, okay, who? I mean, I don't have to say, who are you? You're obviously from that house over there.
Right. Yeah.
What the hell is going on? It's like, we only have 9 guys for a minyan. You need 10 Jews to do the prayers before Shabbos. Okay. It's Friday afternoon. I knew enough to know that that was a viable thing. So he said, would you come over and daven with us for the minyan before Shabbos? And I said, no, no way. First of all, I don't care. Second of all, fuck you. And that's it.
Yeah.
So he's like, he remembered what I said. And he's like, we'll give you Kabbalah books. We'll, so all he had to
Okay.
do was say that. And I have no shoes on, right? I'm like,
Uh-huh.
I'm like really disheveled. So I'm like, you know what? Okay, fine. So I walk around with this weird looking guy wearing knickers and a giant hat. And I walk in to this house and I'm counting, and there's like at least 20 guys there. And this is predicated on the fact that they only had 9 for a minyan. So I walk
Right.
in, I knew immediately something was seriously wrong. And before I could say, hey, wait a minute, the door slammed shut and locked. And this guy was looking at me funny, and I was waiting for a lot worse than I got, because nothing really bad happened, but I was waiting for I'm like in my 20s. I'm waiting for my pants around my ankles. I'm
Yeah,
like,
right.
you guys are nuts. So I said, you know what? I think I want to go now. And they're like, no, we're not letting you go. So, okay, what do you want? What they wanted was maybe the weirdest thing that anyone has ever said to me. They said, you haven't had your bar mitzvah.
Okay. First off, were they right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd never had a bar mitzvah. I wasn't
Okay.
raised with any kind of religion whatsoever. I told them that when I went over the first time.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
So I'm like, yeah, okay. So what? You're going to kidnap me to give me a bar mitzvah? Is that the deal? Is that what's going on here? And basically it was. So they whip out a giant handmade Torah scroll that they had ready. And they're like, you're putting on tefillin, you're reading out of the Torah, or you're not leaving.
Wow. That is okay. So from what you told me, the little bit you told me in Messenger, this is even more bizarre than I could have ever imagined. That's
It gets better than that. So I don't know Hebrew, and I'm looking, and they're telling me what the words were. They were pointing to the words and say this, say that. Okay, I repeated it as best I could. Okay, great. You had a bar mitzvah. So I'm looking around the room and I'm seeing all these weird looking guys. I'm like, where are my Kabbalah books?
right.
Motherfucker.
Yeah.
At this point, you better be forthcoming with the Kabbalah books. And they gave me some really lame stuff. I mean, it was really disappointing what they gave me. They gave me some Menachem Schneerson material and, some like second-rate Chabad stuff that didn't go too deep. And I just got out of there and never saw them again. Okay, that's fine. So you fast forward, what was it? 20, 30 years, I guess. I'm living in the Hermitage where I study tantric alchemy. And my teacher thinks it's a very good idea to send me back to Brooklyn to really learn Kabbalah for real, and not the simplified version that I was pretty good at that point. And that was my mission, leaving the Hermitage where I lived, to go back to Brooklyn, to find some teachers, some Jews, do what I got to do, study the system, learn it for real, which involved me ultimately becoming a black hat Jew for a little while and living that life to learn that system. Okay, so I'm looking around Borough Park, Brooklyn for some Hasids willing to teach me. And I talked to this one, I talked to that one. I don't even know how I got steered to it, but I went to this one class in an apartment where this really nice, tall, skinny guy was giving an impassioned lecture on Breslov Hasidus. And this rabbi was talking to a bunch of people who seemed relatively disinterested. It was obvious to me that this guy was willing to teach anybody who would listen. He was just like that generous. And I liked him. So after the lecture, which I barely understood because it was like half in Yiddish, half in English, I started talking to the guy, and he kind of took a liking to me because I pretty much would guess he never saw another person like me ever. So we're talking, and I'm like, you want to ride home? Okay, I'll give you a ride home. So we're talking in the car, riding around Borough Park, me and this Hasidic rabbi, and I tell him that story about being kidnapped to have a bar mitzvah. And his jaw dropped, his mouth was open, and he was staring at me and didn't say anything. And then he pointed at me and he said, "That was you?"
Oh my goodness. Oh, wow. How?
So I said, "You were there? You were in that room?" He's like, "Yeah, those guys were nuts." "I got the hell out of there myself," he said.
Wow.
And
Okay.
that guy became my teacher for several years. And I ended up studying with that guy pretty much every day for years, and on and off for about 10 years. I mean, I became very close with him, that fellow. And he was there in that room. And it's funny because when you're doing drugs and you're in your 20s, things happen to you and you wonder later, did I imagine that? Right. Was that real? And so I had this guy to run by, and he's like, yeah, that happened, and they were nuts. And he said he didn't want to have anything to do with them either.
Right. Yeah. What are the odds? I mean, that's, it speaks to whether or not it said this to you as you were going through that, it speaks to the contemplative path itself, again, like we were talking about in Messenger, I know you having met your teacher, at the Hermitage, that is kind of like a spoke around which a lot of these experiences that you've had make sense, because the otherwise, I mean, what are the odds that you would even, see somebody from that house again?
Well, it goes back to that first commandment, right? Like, you shall have no other God before me. You shall have no other interest other than the great work, essentially. If you look at it like that, if you take that to be the meaning of such an edict, then you're operating according to a system of priorities which are not the normal ones, let's say. So is it that much of a stretch to conclude from that connections between people and events, circumstances of different types, will have a different emphasis than randomness or your desires or happenstance, whatever it might be? And that if you're truly not interested in anything else, you are following a thread which you can't really understand completely or judge the value of while you're in it. If you are dedicated to the great work above all other things, there's a certain faith that you must place in the process, because it is borne out by how well it's going for you. Like, for example, what you said, if I'm at the Hermitage and I'm judged to go back to Brooklyn and I meet this character, it's obvious that those things are connected. How could they not be?
Right.
So you develop a certain faith that if I keep going in this direction where things seem to be profoundly interconnected with each other, the fabric of my life is woven that way, that all I have to do is just keep going and not deviate or get sidetracked. So it increases its own potency. It becomes more intense when you live like this, that as things progress and prove themselves to be efficacious, you have to keep going at that point.
Right.
I mean, there's really no choice in the matter.
Yeah.
Other than fucking it all up.
Could you say in that kind of case, in that scenario, that that is a tycoon of experience itself? Like, we could take those things separately and look at them, but when looked at the interconnectedness of it, like, it's the poison that becomes the medicine, like you said. Or am I just going off the deep end and
well, it's pretty easy to say that looking back. In the moment, you don't know, do you?
Right.
In the moment, you really don't know. So in the moment where the question is, am I doing the right thing? Am I making a mistake? that's really the issue, because you don't know.
Right.
So you have to take a risk, right? You have to take a risk. And the only thing that you have is your dedication to the work, right? And if you rely on that, you've got a different means by which you can investigate than an ordinary person would. You've got a different standard for the meaning of your life and what's important to you, and what your desire force, the trajectory of your desire force is thrust towards, than an ordinary person would, which doesn't make you special and spiritual and blah, blah, blah. It just gives you focus, right? And the
Right.
ability to concentrate.
Yeah.
And that's really what it is. It's a matter of focus and clarity of concentration, which of course bears itself out on a moment by moment basis. But it either proves itself to be effective, or you end up in a mess, and one passes through the flux and flow of various variations of that.
Right.
Degrees of messes, degrees of miracles, right?
Yeah.
And luckily for me, if you're asking me, I'll tell you about what's happened to me in my life. It's been pretty straightforward. It's being like amazingly one thing leading me to the next thing has worked out. I don't know why it's worked out. I can't explain it, but it seems that if I stay focused on the path, it's only good.
Absolutely.
It's never been bad.
That kind of goes or hits at the thrust of, even starting this podcast, and, leads me to the next question, much like, along the path, following, the next thing to the next thing. How, and I know, actually, that's a lie. I was about to say, I think that you're reticent to give people advice because, I know you've told me that you don't want to be anybody's teacher, but in the notion that we want to opt out of culture, what do you think is the biggest barrier, or what do you think is, if you can even speak to that, because I know we're talking in generalities.
Excellent question. Opting out of culture is the way to do what I'm referring to. It's the way to stay on the concentrated focus of the work itself, because, as I've said, single pointed focus means that you're not interested in anything else. That is pretty rare because people have various interests. So what are these interests? Well, these interests are trajectories of desire, generally, where you chase down what you want because you like it, and you chase the opposite. You get away from what you don't want, which is not pleasurable to you. So you get away from what you don't want and towards what you think you want. So if the sum total of your life's activity are chasing like and dislike, personal choices of what appeals to you and what you think bears the most fruit in relation to your life, if you're an ordinary person, it's pretty easy to map out what the ordinary person is interested in. They're interested in feeling pleasure and getting away from pain. They're very often interested in perpetuating their own confusion and operating in a sort of a fog where pleasure and pain are the guidelines on the road that take them to an unknown place that they've not examined. And they function along species behavior. They want to reproduce, they want to acquire comfort, blah, blah, blah. Everybody knows what this is. So culture is just a way of taking the general consensus of a style of conventionality and ordering it to a time and a place. That's really all it is. When culture includes within it esoteric interests, or interests that are not part of the general habit patterns of conventionally fixated beings, you have a type of culture that's really very rare. And that has only happened a handful of times in the history of the world where truly profound esoteric virtues are actually in the culture and acted upon. The memory of distant ones sometimes are perpetuated for multiple generations, but the peak of cultural achievement where it really speaks to the fullness of human experience, rare thing. Generally, it's a conventionality fest that all it does is act as the sum total of the aimless desires of conventionally fixated beings who want to be happy, right? They want to chase what they think will make them happy. Unfortunately, the problem is that when people get the things that they supposedly want, it doesn't actually make them happy. And if it does, it's not for very long. And acquiring things and experiences and circumstances and getting what you want, ironically, doesn't make people very happy at all. They're always wanting something else, or circumstances change, and what made them happy yesterday is not what makes them happy tomorrow, and on and on and on. And it becomes an endless chasing that never resolves itself. It seems to me that the real source of happiness, the thing that actually makes people happy, is realization of the ground in some form, because that's the basis of meaning. It puts, I mentioned Frankl earlier. Yes, I think meaning in a person's life makes for happiness. Happiness is a meaningful life. Our culture, for example, doesn't really seem to place a great value on profound meaning in life at all. It's a bunch of very quick, superficial solutions to unresolvable problems. So what does that leave the practitioner in terms of options? Well, the one that I find most effective in my life is a wholesale rejection of the culture and an opting out of it. Getting out of town, not buying in, not watching the news, not taking in the ethos of the zeitgeist, and not listening to others, and doing my work, living basically as a hermit apart from society. Because from my point of view, from my vantage, it's nothing but a sand trap. It's quicksand. It will grab you and you will sink. And I don't see much benefit in it. I used to be in culture marginally. I used to be in the art world. I had shows of artwork and whatnot. And I don't do that anymore. I don't even want to go to a museum. I don't want to be in a cultural institution. I don't want to have contact with a university, for example, which seems to be more about indoctrination of people than, the dissemination of wisdom or speculation or refinement of thought. So opting out, to me, is the medicine for a disease. It's the way to concentrate on what's really important and eliminate everything that interferes. So to me, opting out, and I'm not telling people to opt out.
Right.
I'm not telling people to do anything, but I'm saying that my work functions that way. It's a consequence of being a hermit mystic, which I've been doing. And I could tell you how I've been doing it for a very long time, but I've been doing it in a very radical sense ever since I did a 3-year retreat at one point in my development. And during that period of time, lived in formal silence, and it instituted certain laws that I still live by today. So being a retreatant or a dedicated practitioner, opting out of society, not participating in society, not wanting to hear about it, is the best solution to the problem of all of this nonsense that is thrust at me, where I have to turn off the news feed on Yahoo when I get my email. I don't want to see that stuff at all. It makes my life worse and not better.
It's
Hopefully that answered it.
that definitely answers it. And just a quick aside, when you said about not even wanting to go to a museum, it's weird how culture has idolized culture. Like I didn't even think about the fact that you're literally going to a place to look at culture, in different
In a
um,
glass case as a
right,
specimen.
right. That's so bizarre to even think about that now.
Right. Well, I am saying this having spent a huge chunk of my life in the years between, I believe, 1993 and I think 1996. It was about 3 years, 3 to 5 years. I went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art every single day of my life. I went there every day. I went there in the morning when they opened. I parked my car. I walked in. I stayed till closing or near closing every single day. And what I did in the Metropolitan was I brought books, I read, I looked at things, and I considered this dilemma, the dilemma of culture, the dilemma of trajectory, the dilemma of history, and what it means to somebody who aspires to that which is not bounded by time or bounded by space. And that's a problem. How do you resolve that problem? To me, the Metropolitan at that time was a temple to ponder this question.
Mhm.
It even looks like a temple.
Right. Yeah,
And when
absolutely.
you walk up those steps, I used to feel like I was going into a holy place until I realized that assumption was based on a series of suppositions that once I had a real good look at them, I went the other way with what I thought about what was being put forth there. And the same thing happened to me with universities. There was a time when I was a kid, I believed in universities and I believed that they were temples of learning. Look what happened there. Do I even have to comment on that
Right.
disaster?
Oh, no.
So all cultural institutions are shaped by the culture. So the value system of the culture is inherent in its institutions.
It's kind of funny, like you say that, and I remember reading in an art theory course I was in, Arthur C. Danto talking about the end of art as a history, you know, and, like it, they're always these guys are always so close to being dead on to what's going on, how it's a culture that's eating itself, and at the same time, that is an expression of it. It's still part of it.
I know the book you're talking about. Arthur Danto's, was it Transmutation of the Commonplace by Danto?
I believe that's the
I think it
title.
was.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I know that book. And he gives an example in that book of a big red triangle or big
Right.
red
Yeah, that's the
rectangle.
one. Yep.
Yeah. And he says, you put the big red rectangle in a parking lot and it has a certain value. You put it on the wall of a gallery or in a museum, it has the same object, changes its context and thereby changes its meaning. So the actual object doesn't have inherent qualities. It only has implied contextual qualities of meaning by implication.
Right.
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 So if that's the case, that context implies the framework of levels of meaning, at what point do you disengage from the actual facticity of the experience? At what point does it just become rhetoric, philosophy, head game, verbiage, linguistic play, and assumptions?
Right.
And
Yeah.
what I found in our culture is that, especially in art, the actual contact with beauty and truth and goodness has shrunken to like a tiny little ancient raisin in a sea of syrup. And the syrup is the blah 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 conceptual nonsense. It's to the point where museums are even considering doing away with the artifact to just have a presentation of the context. That's how art historians are being trained now. It is overwhelmingly conceptual postmodern rhetoric framing nothing, framing an empty shell of a rumor of an experience that might or might not have existed at one point to someone.
Wow, that is body mind boggling, if such a thing exists. That's,
well, all you got to do is just look at the developments in postmodernism, both philosophically and in terms of its implication in the making of art and commerce for the past 30 years.
right.
It's pretty obvious that something that was once vital was slowly dying and dried up and became atrophied, and eventually atrophied to the point that it became desiccated and flaked off and was blown into the wind. And what a sad thing. But who cares, really? We have work to do.
Right. Fair.
And our work makes it a joyous thing to say, yes, culture has deteriorated to the point that I could now dispose of it with impunity and be happy in the effort and gleefully proclaim my luck and the beneficence of the universe in bestowing me with this opportunity to not be bothered by anybody and sit in my house and do my practice to the exclusion of everything else. Because there was a time when the ignorant villagers with the torches would be coming up the block, and maybe they don't like what I'm doing, but they're not there now because nobody cares. That's the great thing about this work of contemplative mysticism. Nobody gives a crap what we do in that vein. It's not challenging anybody. It's not threatening anybody. I'm not promoting any kind of anything that anyone even would care to misinterpret. There's just no relevance to them whatsoever. So they can't cancel me. They can't accuse me of any thought crime because they don't know even what it is that I'm doing to be accused of something. They wouldn't even be able to pinpoint that there is something being done in order to accuse it falsely or rightly or whatever.
Right.
So I have no interest in the culture whatsoever. To me, it is a drunk, staggering ape dancing on the end of a cliff.
Wow, that's an amazing visual metaphor right there. I'm playing with that in my head. Let me ask you, following that up, and again, as always, help me out where I get it wrong, or correct me when I'm misinterpreting your work. So, with the 32 keys, one of the things that I know that's happened to me as far as my work is concerned is, and I don't mean to say that it's happened fully, but there has been a dissolving of what matters. And I mean, as a direct result of doing the three different exercises. So, I have this thing that I turn into a concept, and it's, say key number one. And then I take key number one, and, while it sits outside of me and while I'm contemplating it, there's this, and I say outside of me, there's this interaction that I believe is going on with an artifact. Then I imagine it internally, and I deal with that. I don't try to interpret it. I don't try to get conceptual about it. But then I take even that away, and it feels like what's been going on as a result of that is dealing conceptually with life, seeing how it's actually an internal process, and then allowing it to die, allowing all of that just to fade away because it's not important and it doesn't matter anyway. Do you think one is that part of what makes the system work? I mean, and I know that would be kind of like, what's the word for it? It would be you getting into my mind,
No. What you're saying is very clear. It's interesting that you mentioned this because I'm right now rewriting the entire book the text of the 32 Keys for reissue as a second edition. And I'm really rewriting the entire book to the point where there are not a lot of sentences from the original book that are going to remain. I'm rewriting the entire thing.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But I'm keeping the meaning the same. It's not going to really deviate that much from the first edition. It'll just be stated clearer with more examples, some added information and whatnot, but I'm not changing the ethos of it. And in the introduction to the book, I more clearly describe the practice that you're talking about, where 32 Keys is basically a system overview of the path, the non-dual path of mystical contemplation. You could symbolically see an overview of the progression from general principles to specific methodological adaptations to the end results.
Okay.
And what I give are 3 exercises. The exercises are exercises that I was trained in different forms in other systems that I basically applied to this system. It's a standard way of mind training. You have concentrated focus on an object, and first you concentrate on it as an external object, and then you concentrate on it as an internal object, and then you concentrate on its lingering presence without any object whatsoever. Now, the external object includes concepts about the object. So you visualize the object, or you see it in front of you like the physical key, and you think about it. You think about what it means, what its implications are. That's a good outer level of meaning. Then that's the first exercise. The second exercise is you stop it in its tracks and you use some technique to concentrate on it as an inner dynamic. And the usual way to do that is as a visualization. The visualization can be done in various ways. I suggest a specific one in the book. It could be inside your mind. It could be projected in the space in front of you. Doesn't matter. Just the fact that it's a visualization means it's an inner dynamic, which is certainly very different than looking at something and thinking about it, which is its outer skin, you could say. So you're making this shift from an outer level of meaning to an inner dynamic of meaning. And you essentially have concentrated focus on the visualization, and you hold it steady and clear, and you don't allow your mind to move into what it means and whatnot. You just concentrate on the clear, bright vividness of it. The third exercise is you take away anything to look at, and you essentially take the space in which all of this activity had previously occupied, and you allow attention, awareness, and the appearance of that space to melt through each other and pass through each other. And you simply contemplate on the open possibility of the space that has just presented itself in the previous 2 exercises, leaving nothing. It's essentially a direct contact with the plenum, with the ground. So you go from external object to internal object to no object, which is the opportunity for the ground to seep through the practice and ultimately, on a very sophisticated level, invite you into its heart, invite you into its essential nature. And those 3 aspects of contemplation are in so many systems in various forms, in various ways. They're like outer, inner, and secret aspects of just about anything, right? You find them certainly in most systems in some form or another when they're interested in the ground, when they're interested in the essential basis of reality. You find them disguised in various ways, and even in exoteric religion, they are present in the way that the sacred is approached by the mind, right? Where you have an initial external presentation and then some sort of process, which is the means to present it. And it goes into the mystery. It keeps going into nothing. So it's the difference between object and process, or means of introduction, and in endlessness, that you go through that into an open-ended state. So, I think that if one is interested in making one's life, the sum total of one's life, an act of practice, a sacrificial offering, an act of contemplation, if you will, one has to treat every detail this way. And just because it disappears at the end, so called, it doesn't negate the fact that there's an outer presentation that you began with. They don't eclipse each other, right? The skin of the world continues to present itself. But after you see it from three different angles simultaneously, you realize that these are three different registers of the same thing.
Right. Yeah.
It's not like the first one is lesser or wrong somehow.
Okay. Okay. Gotcha. That clears that up.
Yeah.
Because I think I was having that problem actually.
Yeah, sure. Because we're used to causal, sequential, hierarchical thinking. We're used to an emanationist view.
Right.
No, these are three takes on an incomprehensible reality that your mind could never summarize. So what you're training yourself to do is see it three different ways. And ultimately, there are three different ways of seeing the same reality. Whether it presents itself or not should make no difference.
Okay.
The real is not defined by what seems to be. The possibility is just as alive as the actual display.
Could you say, going back to what we were talking about with the first commandment, then, that if we were to quote unquote look at reality, there's no way that we could escape, if escape were a thing, this notion of, having another God before, and so like it doesn't exist. It's impossible.
Well, it depends if we're really truly interested in the mystery of it or not. Most people
Okay.
aren't. Most people could care less about the great mystery that is presented to them in the sum total of their lives, and they're just looking for circumstantial solutions to individual problems that they have.
Right.
Living a circumstantial life of navigating experience and maximizing, let's face it, maximizing what they like and minimizing what they don't like. That's
Right.
the life of most people, right? If you're interested in something other than that, the mystery itself, you're a very odd person. You're really rare if that's your interest.
Right. Okay. So there's going to be some spots where I'm going to have to obviously edit because
Maybe
right
not.
now I'm just okay. I just like as you said that, it's just like it's one of those things where it's like anything that was going on in my head right now seems like it's been empty. Like I want to consider that
the flow has been good. The flow up to this
Yeah.
point, the flow has been like amazing. So
Yeah.
just keep going.
Okay.
Or I'll keep talking.
So
I got stories.
well, let's hear one of them.
Well, I grew up as, I didn't grow up like this, like the guy that you see here. I grew up a real different kind of a guy.
Mm.
And everything worked out, but it worked out the hard way. And, I grew up and had to do a lot of fucking up to get it right.
Right. Yeah.
So if people think that they couldn't possibly practice because they've made this or that mistake, come on.
Right. Just remember to fail well, right?
Well, remember to keep going and constantly ask yourself, what's it all about? What's the purpose of this? What's the end game?
Right. Right.
The ultimate intention of why you're doing what you're doing, like we were talking about before when we mentioned ceremonial magic. My answer to you was I have nothing against ceremonial magic at all, but
Yeah.
I definitely call into question why certain practitioners are doing what they're doing. Because when I hear the process degenerating into the manipulation of phenomena, the manipulation of circumstance to get some coherent outcome, to me, it seems like you're opening yourself up to be played with by forces that you can't keep track of.
Right. Right.
And
Well,
and
and
those forces have a vested interest in your manipulation.
if there's any merit to the idea that the universe doesn't put forth more energy than it needs to, then why is it, would you try and accomplish material gain if you don't know how to brush your teeth? Why? And what I mean by that, I'm stretching that out. Like if you're having, an issue, say, with gum inflammation, there's no point in contacting a demon or an angel for that matter. You have other issues going on.
Well, there's subtle levels of intentionality and there's outer and inner levels of intentionality. For example, you could say in an outer sense, I am doing this for the great work because my love of the divine is more important than anything else. You might say that and you might even believe that. But at the same time, you could harbor all kinds of subtle intentions of what you really want that maybe you yourself can't even really face.
That's a fair
Maybe
point. Yeah.
your desires are manipulating you on levels that your intellect is not capable of observing.
Is there a way that you can think of that somebody can address that in their own work? Because I'm sure I've got many things that come up for me when I sit to meditate, like you and I have even talked about in the past, where you know I know it's a good desire to be concerned with Ein Sof, but it's still a desire and it still has other desires that hang on to it, like this notion of what it means to um be enlightened or self-realized or anything like that. It's like, how does one address that in themselves? I mean, obviously you try and be as honest and open with yourself as possible, but
It's a very good question. I would say that in the end, when it comes to my talking to other people, I have no idea
right.
how somebody would address that. I can tell you how I've addressed it in my own life, but I don't know if that's applicable to anybody else. I'm not really sure that a great majority of my work is applicable to anybody else, but this is what I do. And I put my data out there. That's what I've been asked to do by those who have taught me. That's my work. I'd say the best yardstick that you could use to assess this problem is what you do with your time. Because let's say even that you do, 6 to 8 hours of practice a day. What do you do after that? Right? What do you do when the work is over and you could do anything you want? That'll speak more towards the hidden agendas of your mind than almost anything else. When you really look at the sum total of your use of your time and energy and you see where it's going, like, are you pursuing other things that have a secret pull on you that that after you do 6 hours of practice, you just can't wait to watch some stupid TV show or to drink a whiskey? And how important really is that in your life? Do you ever sit there in the moments of stupid relaxation and think to yourself, I am more satisfied now, if I would be honest with myself, than I was in the middle of my practice room? Like, what's it all about? Where is the real emphasis? What holds up the actual living forth of your life? And in the moments where you find yourself letting your guard down, where's your mind going in those times? If you really scrutinize that process, you're going to find stuff you're not going to want to see.
Okay.
And that's going to unravel the whole thing. Like, sure, you could proclaim the noble virtues of your aspirations by dressing up in a costume and performing, a Golden Dawn style invocation of an Egyptian deity, and, theatrically present your aspirations to the world and operatically and boldly proclaim as if you're like in Star Trek or something. But then you go home and what do? I think what you do when you go home says more about your practice than the ritual did.
Right. That's fair.
It hides in the hidden areas of your life is the truth. The truth is in the junkyard. The truth is in the slaughterhouse on the floor.
Right. Right. Is there, I go back and forth and well, I'll go back to your answer about you're not sure what's good for other people, but I can say in my own case, um, honestly keeping a journal, uh, as weird as that is, if nothing else, it's sort of like those the food journal that people talk about, or financial journals and all that kind of garbage. But if you're recording what you're doing, that's you have to look at it. You're faced with it. And I know that's one of the reasons it's difficult for me at times to keep a journal, because you're right. I don't want to tell this to myself. I want to be the great practitioner, or whatever the case.
Yeah, but
might
you
be.
see that could go the other way as well, because if you're keeping a journal, you're conceptualizing about your own activity, and that might not necessarily lead you out of the conceptual knots. How do you solve the problem of conceptuality with more conceptualizing? And it's
Right.
even the worst type of conceptualizing. You're conceptualizing about me.
Right. Yeah. Fair. Okay.
This is what
Yeah.
I thought. This is my insight. This is my most sensitive feeling.
Right. Okay.
After a while, you could end up on a mountaintop with a monument to your own conception of yourself.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
not saying that the journaling is bad. I'm just saying that we're
Sure.
journaling already with our conceptuality. Conceptuality is nothing but journaling.
Well, it's like you said earlier, right? Even as far as ceremonial magic goes, it's a tool, and it's how you use the tool, why you use the tool, and what you're actually doing with it.
Yeah, but isn't conceptuality just a running commentary on your own activity anyway? It is journaling.
Yeah. Yeah. Without the paper.
Yeah, without the paper, it's a running commentary on how I feel and what I want and what I'm doing and what I think and where I've gone right and where I've gone wrong from my own perspective. Right. It's like that old joke on the Seinfeld show where one of the characters is talking about lying and the other one says, it's not a lie if you believe it.
Right. Yeah. That's, oh
it's
my
like,
God. Yeah. I mean, how often, like, again, that's another aspect right there. How much am I convincing myself of what I'm writing versus,
you don't know.
Right.
You don't know.
Yeah.
You don't know. And it's impossible to tell. It's really impossible to tell unless you give up the whole operating system completely as reliable. Right. Once you realize that conceptuality is not a reliable way to assess phenomena, it doesn't mean you stop conceptualizing. It just means that you really don't trust it anymore. It's proven itself to be an unfaithful spouse.
Right.
A bad actor, as they say.
Yeah. So, okay. So now we've talked a little bit about, why opting out is a good thing. We've talked about, certain aspects of the path and things of that nature, as far as, being honest with ourselves and keeping it in scope. So when I talked to you in Messenger, we also talked about, the notion about, and maybe I'm beating a dead horse. And so again, let me know if I am. What's the issue with politics, like with body minds trying to govern themselves,
what do you mean?
So like, there's a part of me that says I get opt-out culture, well, I'm trying to speak for an unknown person here, I guess, and that's probably my first problem. But like, I can see somebody asking me, it's like, well, if you don't care about, this situation, like, is it functionally, you know what, I'm losing my own
No,
steam
no,
here
no.
with
I'll
asking.
pick up where you're implying here.
Okay.
I always uh, address the issue of opting out in
Mhm.
any social, cultural, or political context as a non-issue because I only speak in public about my practice,
Mhm.
right? I'm writing books, I'm giving, these interviews or whatever, and this subject comes up a lot, and I always say, who cares,
Right.
right? It's none of my business, not my concern. I have nothing to say. That doesn't mean I don't have an opinion. Of
Ah,
course I have opinions.
right.
Of course I do. But they're just not that important. They're not
Right.
important enough for me to put them in the context of a discussion about the great work.
Right.
So, yeah, I got opinions. They come, they go, they get adjusted. They're a little like this at this time, they're a little like that at that time. But ultimately, that's not the point. The point is to talk about something that doesn't change,
Right.
lead people towards the inquiry in that which is fundamental and essential about reality, not the changing parade of circumstances of the garments that reality wears, where somebody feels like, oh, they don't feel so good and they want something that they don't have, and somebody gets mad and there's a conflict and this and that and addition and subtraction, and at the end of the day, it's just the same old exchange of human wants and desires that has always been there since the beginning of time, and nothing is really ever resolved or is that different.
Right.
So, is it to your liking, or do you have complaints about it? That's really what you're asking when you're asking about politics and culture,
Right.
because it's really pretty much the same.
Yeah. Yeah. Fair.
So I have nothing to say about it, but I have opinions and I'm not going to talk about them.
Fair enough.
Because first of all, they're none of anybody's business. And second of all, they're not important.
Right. Right. Well, and it goes back to some of the other things that we were talking about on Messenger, again, not being important. Um, but it does, now that does bring me to a different step or a different part of the path, which is something, again, you and I have talked about, the necessity, and you have this in the first edition of the 32 Keys, but the necessity of a teacher. Now, I have, something has given me the blessing to have found a teacher, to work a system, to keep moving and making steps forward. I believe that, like, if I have this context of looking back on my life, I believe wholeheartedly that the 32 Keys is a big part of that, you know. Um, but why the necessity for a teacher?
Well, at a certain point, what we said before becomes a real issue. What we said before was the fact that we're in the midst of a crisis and we really don't have the means to make a judgment about it. We don't know the implications of our actions. We can't assess the actual state of our own minds. We can't see our own minds clearly because we are in the midst of using them. It's just like you could say that a knife can't cut itself. That's how hard it is for a mind to see what it actually is. It can't. The knife can't cut itself. The mind can't see itself because it's busy being in operation. So we do not know. So what a teacher does is assess the things that you can't see, give you a direction, hopefully, and even more hopefully, some methodology to do something about your condition, to send you in a direction which is hopefully where you want to go, that they know of better than you do. Short of that, I don't see what the function of a teacher actually is. It's certainly not to perpetuate a tradition and give you a system of codes that's objectively true,
Right.
right? The purpose of the teacher is to work with you, which is why a teacher, to me, has nothing to do with written traditions and has everything to do with an oral, ongoing, lived through experience that is incredibly intimate and personal. That's what a teacher is to me. So yes, there is a certain point in one's practice where it seems that that is most necessary.
Gotcha. Is that also then part and parcel why you've also said both to me and I've heard you say it on other podcasts and things about how functionally there is no method. There's a path, and like you said, you've shown the work you've done and the things that you've done, but there's not a method. It's something that has to be singular. Is that also?
Oh no. No,
Okay.
there are most definitely methods and
Oh, okay.
systems and ways of people pursuing it. I'm only talking about from the standpoint of giving the raw data, exposing people to what I've done through my books,
Okay.
that I'm not supporting any particular methodological approach. I discuss this or that method from time to time in my work, but it's not like I'm giving out a definitive path to people.
Okay. Gotcha.
Where they figure if they get the first book and do what it says, and then read the second book and do what it says, that's an actual path. It is not. No. It is a largely anecdotal presentation of my own open-ended exploration,
right.
which has been distilled from a series of influences that have a common goal to them.
Right. So you might say then, at the very least, I mean, because it sounds like, and I know that that's a trap that I went down for many years of, taking this book to be the be all end all of right. What I need to do. That's another trap that a teacher can help one out of.
If it's a book, you're going to have a problem.
Right. Yeah.
Because fair. What we're talking about, you can't get from a book.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, the book is nice. The book is helpful. The book is a tool every now and then, and maybe indispensable at some point. But if you're getting your path from a book, you're going to hit a wall.
Right.
And that happened to me. I lived through that when I was doing magical work with groups in the early 90s. I did it as hard as I could. I pushed myself to the absolute limit that I could, but ultimately I hit a wall of the systems that I was involved in. So I thought to myself, if I only went to the sources of these systems, if I went to the sources of 17th century alchemy, the sources of the ancient material of Hermeticisms, for example, Greco-Egyptian Corpus Hermeticum, all of the, and now people are going to the magical papyri and whatnot. If I went to the Kabbalistic sources of the actual texts from the 13th century through the Renaissance, if I went to these sources and saw how the systems that I was in were deriving what they derived, I would get a more pure, deeper take on the material. And what I found was that was true to a certain extent, but there were missing ingredients that would always prove to be completely elusive. And those missing ingredients are living things. They can't be frozen into information and presented in any form. You could present symbols of those missing pieces, but the living thing that the symbol leads you to, if it's not present, what good is the symbol? Right. So if I hadn't found a living oral tradition, I would have hit a wall again. And what people find in their spiritual development when they're working from books is a series of walls that they hit one after another. It's very frustrating. The problem is that ultimately you hit enough walls, you could become embittered by the experience and simply give up.
Right.
Which should really be a shame.
Well, and it's still necessary, even getting a little bitter maybe, or it's necessary to hit those walls, or
it could turn into something good on if it works out. It doesn't work out for everybody.
Yeah.
There are some elements of this process that are totally beyond our control.
Okay. Right.
There is a certain point, and this is probably the biggest problem with this idea that has been popularized by Thelema of the will carrying you through. The will is helpless at a certain point. The will is dwarfed by the immensity of pure possibility. Because let's face it, the thelemic will is just the ego in disguise. That's all it is.
Yeah.
And ultimately, you're facing down the mysterium tremendum, and what you think and what you want and what you believe is the right thing is an unknown.
Well, to even talk about, capital W will, it just it it uses a bigger jacket for the same concept, right? I mean, like it's suggesting that there is, it's the first step of reifying something, like to say that there's
Yeah.
a will at all.
Well,
Yeah.
who holds the will? What
Right.
is it? The will of what? An individual, a separate individual,
Right.
an expression that is unique. Well, to me, a unique expression of a star in the firmament is a person. And it becomes an ego, and the ego takes charge of it, and the ego thinks that you tell the ego that it knows what it's doing, and the ego is going to run with that precept.
Right.
The ego really desperately wants to think that it's in charge. And that's one thing that I could say about my style of practice and doing the work that I do with putting out the books and, all the things that I do. I'm not the boss. The work is the boss.
Right.
I am here to attend to the work and do the best job that I can. Doesn't mean I always do it perfectly. I make a lot of mistakes, but I'm not the boss. Clearly not the boss. I'm clearly taking orders from the sum total of the intelligence of an unknown entity. I don't know what the work ultimately is or what it wants to do.
You
It
have
tells me.
Right. Right. And you've told me in passing that you have even if you don't have the day or the month fixed, a certain year as to how long you intend to write. Is that something that it has been static for you? Has that moved?
No, I'm working until 2033,
Right.
and my work has a certain duration and a certain structure. And the last volume of Lightning Flash of Aleph will come out in 2033, as well as the fruition of a larger project called the Metacartograph, which is going to have several different stages, three of which are already completed. And all my work will be resolved at that point, and my work will stop at that point. Should I survive, which I probably will survive to 2033.
Right.
And that is the structure of this is something that I came up with the people who work with me. I'm not in this alone. I have the ear and guidance of others greater than myself, teachers who you've met.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
yeah, I'm working with those folks on
Gotcha.
this. Yeah.
Okay.
And I don't really much like to talk about it,
Yeah. No. I get it. I know. Like I said, there are a few things that seem
They're not
static.
secret chiefs. I'll tell you this. They're not secret chiefs.
They actually exist in
Yeah, they
flesh.
actually exist.
Yeah. And that's one of those places when you gave me the most down to earth advice that I think I've ever received as far as any of this work goes, and it was when I was asking you about the Holy Guardian Angel, and what you told me was why talk to something that's invisible? Why talk to something that's not in the flesh? There are people who are beyond you. Talk to them. And I'm paraphrasing what you said to me, but
If they have wisdom, I mean, the problem with the Holy Guardian Angel is, first of all, let's say, give it the benefit of the doubt, and let's say somebody's practice ended up with communication from a disembodied intelligence that appeared to give them useful advice and so on and so forth. How do you know you could trust it?
Right.
How do you know that it's even more sophisticated than you are? Just because it's disembodied? Who cares? Can it be just as much of an idiot as somebody with a body? These entities that float around the lower astral seem to be replete with just as many problems and fixations and hangups and limitations as human beings are, if not more. They seem to be very often very one-dimensional. Why would you ever listen to them?
Right.
Because they're unique and different, and it's such a shock that they've communicated with you. That warrants actually taking their advice. How do you know that even good advice is not mixed with something else? How can you even assess the mixture from your point of view?
Right.
Seems to me to be taking an awful risk. And I'm saying, by saying this, I'm actually saying that I believe in these experiences that people are having with these entities. I am not doubting that they're having these experiences, but listening to them and basing the structure of your life off of these encounters, it just seems to be extremely short-sighted.
Right.
And ill-advised.
Well, and I mean, even if you take everybody at their word and say that they've had the experience that they've experienced, in some of the instances, I've heard of the tokens that people use to say, this I know verifies my experience because this is what it told me and this is how it happened. And even that, it's like, it's the thinnest shred of synchronicity, like if you're looking at it, I don't know. I immediately find myself wanting to step back from that because I don't want to tell anybody what their experience is, but at the same time, there's this urge to say, at least reconsider, or at least consider it the first time.
Well, let's talk about disembodied beings in the useful sense. Let's say that there are disembodied beings of two types. One type are disembodied beings that are expressions of pure wisdom, right? They are essentially enlightened beings that present themselves as luminous expressions and communicate with practitioners. And that's the wisdom type of being. Then there are worldly disembodied beings that have the same fixations, essentially, that you and I have, but they live in different registers of the hierarchy and occupy certain territories and are predicated on acquiring what is important to them, which is never the ultimate or absolute end of the goal. They are living within what we call the Histalshelus, the chain of creation, in certain registers, and they personify that register. Both types of beings, which do not have physical bodies, are useful to practitioners. The question is, how do I judge the efficacy of these beings and work with them in a way where I'm not either getting it from a book or making it up as I go along and possibly making a huge mistake? Well, the only way that I have ever heard to do this is by taking the advice of somebody who has worked with you directly in an intimate, trusted fashion over years, and taking an oral tradition that is passed from mouth to ear, where groups of individuals work with these beings, and these beings have proven themselves efficacious to the group or lineage in a multi-generational sense. And talking to a living person who is helping and guiding you, who knows you intimately, and says, this being can be trusted. This is their name. These are their qualities. You approach them in this way. Try it. Tell me what happens, and we'll see how it matches up with this other line of people that are doing it at the same time, who possibly have a very clear understanding of what it is. They're alive. They've derived benefit. So if there's anything there, the group consensus of the living oral tradition is going to bear it forth, and then maybe you're going to have something. Maybe you won't.
Right.
I'm not telling you to just believe it.
Right. Sure.
Try it. And if you want to navigate the region that you're in and the elemental constituents to progress through the circumstance of where you are, in seemingly in time and space, you're going to need to pass through the territory of many entities to do this work. Some will be hostile, some will be beneficial, some will be a mixed bag. So some of this work is pretty damn necessary.
Yeah. Okay.
The best way to do it, the only way to do it that I've ever heard, is to align yourself with people who are experts.
Right.
And not try to figure it out yourself or get it from a book.
Yeah.
And certainly not get it from a garbled ancient book.
Does one come to mind that you said it that way?
All the medieval grimoires that
Okay.
list a series of spirits and squiggly looking sigils and tell you this is an entity. How do you know?
Yeah.
How do you know? Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. I'm not saying that these Solomonic spirits aren't real. I'm saying maybe they are. Maybe they're also not what they purport to be. Maybe they are fronts for voracious, malevolent appetites, which are in the business of not making themselves known. And maybe what they want is your attention and your life force. And maybe you're an all-you-can-eat buffet.
Right.
Maybe. How do you know? Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So having been in that situation, I can tell you that the unseen realms of these beings is far more dangerous than going into downtown Detroit in the middle of the night.
Yeah. Yeah, that's not an enterprising idea.
You think that what I'm talking about compares to the streets of Ypsilanti, which are complete with all kinds of dangers? What I'm talking about is far worse.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. Because you could get played in a million different ways, and the stakes are your life and your time and what you think is important. And if you crap out on a lifetime of effort that backfires on you, and you only find out when it's too late, well, that's a very sad thing.
Have you ever encountered it? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, go ahead. You're about to ask a good question.
I was going to ask if you've ever encountered anybody who has been or even yourself, where you've been in that situation, and you say to yourself, like, I know if my training even comes to mind, like if what we've been doing amounts to something.
Well, what do you mean? Well, what do you mean? Have I ever been in a situation that I encountered what specifically?
Where you've encountered an entity who just was looking for life force and
hell yeah. Hell yeah. And I've been told by my teachers to talk about it. Yes, that's happened to me. It scared the crap out of me every single time. It's very scary.
Is it anything you want to share right now, or?
Not, I don't really want to get it. Well, I'll put it to you this way. Wrathful energies that are from the side of enlightenment and scary, wrathful, worldly energies are both very frightening. Mm-hmm. If you don't know, if you're not realized yourself, as I am not, I'm just a practitioner. I'm not through with the path. I'm in the middle of the path, right? Or I'm at whatever stage of the path. I'm not through with it, right? So to me, these are all things that I don't know.
Okay.
And part of the reason why they're fearsome is because I don't know. So even the side of these entities that's benevolent are extremely scary and hard to take and don't feel so good. The entities that are malicious that I've encountered are not more or less scary than things that are supposedly benevolent that I just don't know what they are. It all just basically communicates in a register that's going to feel bad to a conceptually fixated point of view. If you're a conceptually fixated being and you encounter anything that is piercing and vast and has a scope that dwarfs you, you're just going to hate it. It's going to feel horrible.
Right. Okay.
And a lot of that could be in a lot of different categories, good, bad, and indifferent. The amount that we don't know is so vast that when we encounter the skin of this unknowable territory beyond us, we're scared out of our minds.
Right.
If you're honest with yourself, when magicians talk about their work as if they're masters, you generally know within like 2 seconds
Yeah.
whether they're in that category of sort of a mixture of their being deluded and also lying.
Mm.
Right.
Yeah.
Because they think that they know. They're purporting it as if they know. They do not.
Right.
Unless you're really, really one of the rare ones. And in that case, okay, I've met some rare ones. They exist, but it ain't common, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So
Even in those cases where you're meeting something fearsome that's purported to be wholly benevolent, all you can but do is still say or remind yourself that this is in soap, right? Like that's the only.
well, if you're talking about something that you believe is wholly benevolent, you would only come to that conclusion because your trusted teacher would have introduced it to you as a benevolent part of your own practice.
Okay.
And it's a known entity, and you know its name, and you know its form, and you know its attributes.
Right.
So it doesn't mean you can see it clearly, but if its presence makes itself known, if even its shadow passes close to you, you're scared out of your mind.
Yeah.
And of course, I'm talking about wrathful protectors here.
Right. Right.
Wrathful protector entities.
Yeah. It's funny. It's both weird and funny to me. Even as you're talking about this, like there's a certain sense of my ego that's like, kind of on guard as you're saying, like, what the hell? What's going on? I don't know if that makes any sense,
Well, the thing that people really need to hear and do is cut through the fascination with the fact that such things are considered really cool in a sort of a 12-year-old boy wanting to show mommy and daddy how strong and powerful you are sense.
Right.
That once you actually, like I said, contact even the passing shadow of such entities close to you, you realize that the childish notion of their coolness is out the window. Right. It is not what the Black Sabbath album told you it would be. It is. It really and truly is not what you thought in the comic book. The comic book version, the comic book version has its place because it's fantasy.
Yeah.
But what I'm talking about is no longer a fantasy. It doesn't have the luxury of fantasy.
Yeah. Yeah, no doubt. When you said that about the Sabbath thing, though, that's one of those places, and I've asked myself this at least 100 times, and I've also asked people who ask me, like when I have taught the little bit or exposed my ignorance, more like it, that I always wonder why the fascination with demons before angels. Whenever anybody has asked me about anything remotely hermetic, magical, whatever the case might be, it always starts with the demons. It never starts with, I want to talk to, this archangel or that archangel,
Right. Well, if there's a fascination, where does a fascination come from? It comes from the psyche. It's a psychological fascination. So it can't be related to the reality of these things. It is just a psychological projection of something. So when somebody becomes fascinated with a psychological projection, which another word for that is a fantasy, you're not talking about the subject. You're talking about something entirely different having to do with the imagination. It's not the actual subject that we're talking about. It is a psychological departure in the imaginative realm. And there are magicians who do all sorts of things supposedly with their imaginations. And they better have a series of safeguards in place to verify or test out their data if they're going to work that way. Because it seems to me that anytime you're in uncharted territory and you're the only one who knows what you know, and there's no one else for you to run it by, you really should assume that you're wrong. You should really, our minds are so small that if we don't have a reference point to verify beyond our point of view, how could we possibly be right in the immensity of possible things? How could we have the hubris, the conceit to think that our conclusions would be correct with our tiny little minds in the vastness of infinite possibility? It just doesn't make sense. It just doesn't seem like a good bet.
Yeah.
So I just assume that my imagination is always wrong and my conceptual analysis is always flawed. And my work is finding the flaw.
Mm. Right. Well, and that's the way to go about it, right? It's to falsify what you do, in one sense.
Well, if you're working with a lineage that holds proof of its own efficacy and you've spent enough years with it that you now trust it, then you have something to go on and you're not in that position anymore.
Oh, that's fair. Yeah.
You know,
Good point.
so we're talking about the question is of somebody who's working on their own versus somebody who's working an actual path.
Right.
If you're working a path, you take it up with your teachers or whoever is working with you. But if you're working on your own, that's what I'm addressing here. Because I think you're going to record this podcast, and a lot of people who might listen to it are working on their own.
Right.
That's why I said what I said.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and there's a laundry list of things that amazes me about that subject in and of itself. When I was younger, and I'm not going to try and make this about me because we're trying to talk about your work, but a real quick aside, when I was younger, I remember thinking to myself, like reading Rigardi's Big Black Brick, man, I wish there was a Golden Dawn out there that I could apply to, because trying to do that on my own, even just that, and that is so prefabricated, so sitting inside the squares of what isn't reality is ridiculous. I can't imagine somebody who starts knocking on the wall of, I'll say real reality for a lack of a better term, it's mentally daunting to think about how little, and it's not self-effacing or anything like that. I'm not trying to be Socrates here, but the amount or how little I know about anything is just beyond ridiculous.
Well, the missing ingredient, or I should say an uncommon ingredient in a great deal of Western magical operation is vulnerability. And I think that vulnerability is the secret ingredient to a whole lot. Uncertainty and vulnerability, right? They're very, very important elements to the mixture of one's work. Because if you don't have them, what are they filled in by? They're filled in by assumptions that you are sure about things that maybe you should question. Right?
When you say
So
vulnerability, what vulnerable to what?
Vulnerable to exposure to the unknown or unknowable aspects from your point of view of your work.
Gotcha. Okay.
If you are vulnerable to problems that you cannot solve, right? And if there is an uncertainty that brings you in contact with forces beyond your control and beyond your knowledge, you're in the best position to inquire about what you are really interested in. If you plug up those holes with a psychological artifice of thinking that you're sure about this or that thing, you're bound to seal yourself up in your own prison.
Right.
So the question is how to manage vulnerability and uncertainty in a structure that keeps you moving in a certain direction, that has order and discipline and can be acted upon, and not lose your way, because too much uncertainty and vulnerability and it becomes a sloppy free-for-all, which doesn't benefit anybody. So obviously that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about using one's vulnerability and uncertainty in the structure as a tool or a necessary component to fall back on the areas where you will not know. And unknowing in and of itself becomes incredibly important.
Does that kind of unknowing, what you're talking about right there, does that have its own rasa? You know, because I
Oh,
can
yeah.
okay, yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, think about it. Think about the, what's a good example of this? There was a story about a Zen monk and a rhinoceros. I forgot how it went, but the guy in Japan who's never seen a rhinoceros all of a sudden saw one, and it was just so incredibly shocking that the shockwaves of that opened up a vulnerability to the mystery, because all of a sudden the world was so different than you thought that it was. Like, holy crap. And then the whole thing shatters, you know. I don't remember exactly how the story goes, but basically it's the idea that we think we're living in a world that we understand. How conceited is that? We think we have any fucking idea what is going on with us or what the mind is.
right,
How could we possibly be right?
yeah,
Yeah. So this is why I tend to deal with phenomena as a klipa, as a mental summary of something that is wrong, that is incorrect, that
right,
has layers and skins. And when you penetrate their networks of operation, which are very complex, interpenetrating complexities of systems and networks that are co-emergent and mutually non-exclusive, right? You will get caught up in very easily in grasping to the familiar as a way to try to make sense of your situation. The mind will always try to make sense of its activity. That it's designed to do that. It's designed to return to a default setting all the time. Um, Linear coordinates in time and space, self-identification, the reification of objects of phenomena. The mind is programmed to magnetically return to those habit patterns over and over again to make sense of its condition. When you even challenge being sure that you think you know what this means, is a huge thing. And the mind doesn't like it. The mind will rebel by producing chaos. You don't know. You're confused. You are now confused. So what do? Right? If you do practice along the lines that I'm talking about, you're going to get confused. Then what?
right,
Then
yeah,
what? You know, it's the confusion is not the point. It's then what? That's the point.
right, and then return to the ground.
Right. Well, if
Yeah,
you have a coherent view
yeah.
to
Oh,
guide that
that's fair.
return, then yes, but most people don't. So,
Yeah,
I mean, generally, people have not thought out that question of what is the view of phenomena? What is reality to me? Well, if you've personified it in a magical system that might have other motives than the investigation of the real, like maybe its priorities are different. You know, maybe the priorities are about power or about ideas of notions of mastery, self-determination and will and so forth. You're kind of going to be in the dark, in the deep end of the pool, if you know what I mean.
yeah. Well, you know, and you're bringing up something that's reminding me, and I'm going to ask if it has any relevance, but it's reminding me of when we've talked about Nisargadatta Maharaj. You know,
Mhm.
I'm still dealing with something that we talked about as, I mean, I still don't even know what the hell a human being is. You know, like I know
Right.
that we're a cluster of body mind habits that are, as you put it, you know, magnetically fixed on phenomena as an experience.
Well, there you go. You just defined it. What is a human being other than a collection of habits?
Yeah,
I mean, that's
right.
it.
Yeah,
Habits of substance, we call body. Habits of mind, we call psyche. Habits of organization and pattern that we call logic.
yeah,
It's a series of habits. It's a mass of habits. It's a heap of habits. I wouldn't even call it an organized massing. It is a disorganized heap.
Gotcha. Yeah. So if that's the case, I mean, well, no, there's clearly proof. I say there's proof. I accept it because I haven't seen some of the things that you've seen, but I accept that there may be evidence out there of being able to unheap those habits. You know, at the end of the day, then, like, do you look at the path itself and say, here's this one part that's designed to take a human out of its habits so that it can help other humans out of their habits? Like, that seems like the compassion element, say, of, any of these schools.
Well, when I hit a wall at the point that I mentioned before, having gone through magical orders and then looking to the sources and hitting wall after wall after wall, I came up with another solution, right?
Mhm.
If the first solution was magical order, the second solution was sources. The third solution was actually meeting individuals who are more advanced than myself. The minute that you meet anyone who's more advanced than yourself, you can ask them questions and go on a series of living investigations that are not coming from a frozen book somewhere from time or your own mind. Automatically, you're in a whole new territory when you're dealing with living beings who are more advanced than yourself. Finding them is huge.
Yeah.
Right? So
Yeah.
I found some beings more advanced than myself, and I chose to listen to them.
Right. Okay.
And that was the beginning of it.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, this is speculation, and do with the question what you want. This is the I'll make this my last question because I want to keep it kind of themed. So
Okay.
if we go somewhere else, we go somewhere else, whatever. But if you take somebody like Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, a person like that seems to have used culture to its, I'll say, highest degree, because this is somebody that when we've talked about in class, he was able to use exoteric religion and still help people. Is that a fair assessment of that? And if so,
Yes,
okay.
it is.
So,
however,
okay, yeah, I think you know
before
where I
you
was
ask
going.
the question,
Yeah.
well, let me throw this in and then we'll find out. When it comes down to it, when you read Rebbe Nachman, and he's addressing, for like 80-90% of his work, he's addressing issues that pertain to his cultural situation that do not pertain to you and me. We're not Orthodox Jews.
Right.
So most of the stuff culturally that is framing what you're talking about in Rebbe Nachman's work has to be weeded out and thrown away because it's irrelevant to us.
Right.
What the hell do we care about the laws of kashrus or something having to do with Jewish legalistic issues that frame a style of life, which is a living practice that you and I have no interest in or intention of ever following.
Right. Yeah, that already, that immediately answers the question that I was thinking of. I mean,
plus, he's addressing the theistic fixations of a group of people who are on a very primitive level, and he knew what he was saying, but he's speaking to people who don't.
right.
So he had to use theistic language for his culture.
Right.
It doesn't
right.
make him a theist.
Yeah, that's fair. I think that's that's one of the best ways to going back again, and I'm keep just using the phrase to opt out. It's like you're using the one barometer that we heaps of habit forms seem to cling to, because if we look at it in registers, we have these habits down here at some level that make up, like you said, not even organized, just heaps of habits. At another level, at another octave, that is what culture is, right? And so
yeah, but you could still opt out and have networks of association with other practitioners teachers, lineages, which are like cultures unto themselves. And the whole stream of that activity has opted out from the conventional culture.
Right. Right.
So then you get into a discussion of, well, what do you mean by culture? Because isn't a lineage and a community and teachers and students and their exchanges, isn't that a type of culture? Well, yes, it's a type of culture, but it doesn't necessarily, it could have more or less to do with the conventional culture in which it sits.
Right. Right.
You know, like, for example, this was really the main impulse behind a lot of the groups in the Gnostic period after the 2nd century who left, you know, the city of Rome and went out to the desert, said, fuck this, we're establishing our own thing. We don't want to talk to anyone.
Right. Right.
There are times when you can live in the middle of the big city of Rome and there's no problem. There's other times when it's a huge problem. I did my entire 3-year retreat in the middle of Brooklyn. Nobody bothered me. My wife brought me my food every day. She had to move out so I could do this. She moved down the street and she brought me my food, and I did my work, and people could care less. Oh yeah, some guy, he's up in his place, whatever.
Okay, so another question that then comes up, and I'm going to forget the name that you've used for them, but there are people who, for all intents and purposes, from outside looking in, appear to be crazy.
Must.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
So with those people, I mean, it wouldn't matter what part, like whether they were. Hold on, let me back up. I'm trying to pull 30 things in at once. When you talk about your 3-year retreat and having done it in Brooklyn, is there a way to retreat inside of culture? I mean, like, is that what you did? Like,
yeah,
you know, okay.
There's all levels of retreat. The word retreat essentially just implies boundary. And there's infinite variations of boundaries that can be set up for one's practice. It doesn't have to be the classic silent, solitary retreat that people think of in the formal sense. It could be any one of a number of models that are flexible and adaptable, stop and go, or are permeable or short term, or successive, or numbers of hours in the day. It could be anything. Right. Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Limitless possibilities.
I mean, because there also comes a point too at which I've heard you say this, and I mean, like, even this interaction that you and I are having right now, you are permanently on retreat. Am I misquoting you?
No, I am permanently on retreat. I don't really do anything else except eat food and occasionally listen to some music, or maybe late at night watch a movie if I'm just spent.
Right.
But the music and the food and the movie are not my interests. They're just things that happen in the process.
Right. Okay. Gotcha.
I'm not really interested in those things per se. I'm marginally interested in them as connected expressions to a larger framework.
Right. Okay.
I see my relationship with my wife and my marriage as part of my practice.
Right. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, how else could one deal with the issue of interpersonal love so that it made sense, other than as an expression of the divine?
Right. Yeah. That
if it wasn't that, what would it be?
Yeah. I don't even know how to answer that. Yeah, because you're right. I mean, that's the natural progression. That's exactly where I was thinking. And so, for a person who goes to work for 8 hours out of the day, if that meaning has changed, and this is something, and again, I think it's chapter 8 of Deep Principles of Kabbalistic Alchemy. I may be wrong on the chapter number, but I remember, this is something you wrote that, and I'm going to horribly paraphrase it, but literally nothing has to change about your life except the relationship to the meaning you give it.
Right. Yeah. I think that any situation ultimately is workable if the right emphasis on meaning is upheld. If there is a view of meaning that is viable and lived through, there could be any form in which that meaning is presented. If there's enough connection to the ground, the, the dedication to the inquiry and exploration in the ground's manner of expression, you take that as the basic framework for your life, and that's what's important to you. You could do that in infinite numbers of ways, and still the actual essential intention would be untouched by the activity.
Right. Yeah.
You know, and would be pure. Now, if it's not pure and it's compromised, then you deal with the compromises as part of your practice. You know, I mean, our practice is 99.9% purification of impurities.
Right.
But they all have to be predicated on the fact that we have a view to return to.
Yeah.
After the impurities have been exposed and dealt with, you know, or attempted to be dealt with.
Okay. I think I want to stop right there because I think that beautifully sums up the thrust of this. So
nice. We got a good
thank
one.
you. Yeah, thank you very much, David Chaim Smith. I appreciate it. I'm gonna, when I do get this posted, I'm gonna have links to your website for the books. Out of curiosity, a quick plug. When I know you're working on the next issue for the Lightning Flash of Allah. When is that happening?
Okay, it is now the beginning of February. By the end of the month, I'll have the next volume of Lightning Flash of Olive, volume 6, called Black Ether. And it will be, by the first week of March, I should have it ready for sale. And it's a larger book, but it's meant to fit in the profile of the other books. Instead of 8 by 10, it's 10 by 10. So it's deeper, but it's just as tall. And it's shocking. It's the by far the weirdest thing that I've ever done. It even weirds me out when I think about it. It's out there, and it's going to surprise people if they're open to it and don't reject it. So I'm very excited about that. At the same time, I'm working on the second edition of 32 Keys,
Right.
which should come out towards the middle of the year, I guess.
Excellent.
So those are the two projects that are imminent. Beyond that, I have an ongoing series of videos, teachings on the third part of my metacartograph cycle. It's called the Long Scroll, and it's basically a summary of the entire path being spoken out as what we call a drush, or a homiletical discourse, like an oral teaching.
Right.
Except now, in the age of this technology, we could record an oral teaching, and it's essentially very similar to a written teaching. We can access it anytime we want. It's not like the old days where oral teaching meant it disappeared forever.
Right.
You know,
yeah.
Now the line between written and oral aspects is very blurry because of so many ways to access recordings and treat them as documents, essentially.
Right.
So I'm going to be doing that as well. So we have Black Ether, we have second edition of 32 Keys, and we have the Long Scroll happening. And that's going to take me throughout this year, I think.
And Long Scroll people can view online on YouTube, on your YouTube channel, right?
Yeah, the Long Scroll, I think that there's 3 sessions left, and they're all just available for free. Where I've quite a few videos that have a fee charged for them through my website. But Long Scroll, which is in a way really the most important, I probably shouldn't say this, I'm a very bad businessman, but the Long Scroll is probably the most important, and that's why I just given it away for free. So if anybody wants to see what I'm doing and hear me talk about it, go to that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. Well, again, David, thank you for being the first guest on the show. thank you for being here and answering these questions.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Appreciate
it was fun. All I would like to ask is that as soon as you can, just send me the file. And
Absolutely.
I mean, put it up. It's not like I have to approve it or anything. I'm just
Yeah.
curious to watch it over.
Gotcha. Will do.
Yeah, no, don't. I'm not giving any kind of approval. Just put it up. Do whatever you want with it. Just send it to
Yeah.
me.
Will do. Will do. I like I said, I'm probably just gonna. I may edit out the very beginning, like the first 5 minutes, or not 5 minutes, but like the first minute, and then the restroom break. I might just like put the beginning and end.
Yeah, I think the rest of it flowed just fine and as good as anything else. And people are free to investigate these things and ask questions, and people contact me through the contact form on my website all the time. And I don't answer everybody unless my wife makes me, but I answer a good amount of them. So
Yeah.
that's that. And thank you, Augustine.
Yeah. No problem. Thank you. Talk to you soon. Dave.
Okay. Goodbye.
Bye.